Hello, sisters. What I'm going to talk about today, I thought, oh, what's suitable for this gathering, but I wasn't entirely sure what this gathering was, and now I am. So what I'm going to talk about today is how did our struggle against gender identity begin? Where did it come from? How has it developed? What stage are we at? Where should we be going next? How will what we've been doing be thought of in history, in political science, and so on? And I realised that none of this is quite as exciting as the discussion we've already had, which was hugely wide-ranging and absolutely splendid. So I'm kind of tying us back down again to something that is a bit more down to earth, but I'd like to do a bit of more of a big picture look at it, if you like. And if I'm asked where does it begin, I would have to say, let's start with the 2004 Gender Recognition Act in the UK. Now, before that, I've been writing against transgenderism. I've done a chapter in Unpacking Queer Politics on the transgendering of lesbians, and I'd done a piece on that in 1997 too in a journal, so I was well into all of that. And in 2004, I started writing opinion pieces in Australian newspapers against the transgendering of children. So I was already well into that as well. And there wasn't really very much else. Nobody else really was talking about this. And I heard about the Gender Recognition Act and was reading about it in Australia. But I wasn't aware that there was anybody in Britain looking at it, that all the feminist friends that I'd known and so on, nobody seemed to be dealing with that issue or saying anything about it. And I was reading the House of Lords debate on the Gender Recognition Act, and I could not believe it. It was blowing my top, and fumes were coming out of my head in Australia, but I didn't know that anybody was saying anything about it in Britain, and that was extraordinary to me. But in terms of what came next, really, there was internationally, there were some women working on this around 2009, 2010. There were some websites, and there were feminists working on this. And I could probably tell you who they are now, but none of them seem to be there, or maybe they've all gone back to their real names. That's always a possibility. So there was a little bit going on, but no sort of campaigning really happening, no organisations taking up the issue, just some absolutely splendid and very funny websites. Right? So in terms of my seeing it happening in Britain, it was really the RadFem conference of 2012, which was organised by Julia Long, and that was due to happen at Conway Hall. But we got turfed out of Conway Hall and had to find an alternative venue, and that was apparently because I was not to be allowed to speak because I was anti-trans and I spread hate speech. So that was very specifically said, and therefore Conway Hall said we couldn't meet there, and we went to a university to meet. But at that conference there were lots of splendid radical feminists. I don't know whether anybody here was at it. Yeah. Later was. And I talked at the conference in the afternoon I gave a talk called The Queer Assault on Feminism. It was actually on trans, but at that time we didn't want to use that word and make that very obvious because we didn't want to incite the opposition even further. And I wrote a Guardian opinion piece at that time talking about being turfed out of that conference and what was happening and so on. So it was a little bit of a controversy, but there wasn't really any feminist opposition to what was going on. In 2014, Gender Hurts was published, and I came to London to launch the book. A launch also organised with Julia Long, and I did several hours of talks in which I did lengthy introductions to every chapter in the book, because it was a teach-in really. I wanted to get the information out there so that something would be happening in Britain. And there were about 50 women there, and there were a couple of women there at least, who went on eventually to form Women's Place UK. They were at that meeting, so they received all of that information. So in that sense, I think that was probably useful. At that time, there were a number of radical feminists who were very concerned about what was happening around what I like to call sexual fantasy identity. But there weren't any organisations, and the event was secret, the launch, and there were no public events really taking place. And apart from this conference, there was really not a huge amount of visible feminism in Britain. We were at the end of that sort of decade when there was nothing really going on. There was just nothing. The Russell Brand time, I think one might reasonably call it, but that would give him too much publicity. So I didn't return to live in the UK until a year later. But that conference in 2012 made me feel that I should come back and that things could really get going here. They were getting going. And in 2015, Transgender Trend was set up by Stephanie Davis-Arai on transgendering of children, although I didn't meet her immediately. But there was still not much happening publicly until the next very significant event, which was the conference again organised by Julia Long. This time at Conway Hall, because they'd had a conversion on the way to Damascus or something in that intermediate period. And that was called Thinking Differently, and that was in 2016. And that was amazing because it was public. And, you know, 150 women or something, well, at least 100 came to that, and a few men. And that was a milestone event. And many women did great talks about different aspects of the problem, such as Magdalene Burns. And Leah Keith, Julia, me, and so on. And so the issue was firmly launched, I think, in 2016 at that conference. And in 2016 too, the government put out its gender ID proposals for consultation. They wanted to do legislation on it, and that put some energy into feminist activism. It was a bit of a groundswell then. Venice Allen arranged a couple of public events, and I was able to speak at one of those at least. And several of the women who came to my launch, as I say, in 2014, set up Women's Place UK in 2017. And after that, a number of organisations were set up, such as Fair Play for Women, and they continue to be set up, of course. And in late 2018, a small group of women was got together by Joe Brew to create the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which was launched as a side event of the CEDAW conference in New York in March 2019. And from the declaration, of course, the concept and the language of sex-based rights began to take off, and the rest is history, as they say. Groups in each political party were formed to campaign for the protection of sex-based rights, and the phrase really caught on. So it's now being used routinely by politicians, and that's a huge success. Yeah. Because you have to have language, and now there is language. So in the UK, many of the organisations have been focused on one particular issue, such as great success on the transgendering of children. And we're probably all aware of the progress that's been made on that, and on many other issues too. And I'm not in a position to sum up, and I don't know enough about the different organisations that have made huge progress, not actually very much yet, on prisons, changing rooms, sports, and so on and so on. But in terms of mainstream politics, of course, we have cumulatively achieved a great deal, from the cancellation of that original gender ID legislation to the wonderful work by sisters in the Labour Party behind the scenes. You've got Keir Starmer to admit that women don't have penises, and to make it unlikely that they will bring back the worst form of gender ID, though they still seem keen to satisfy some of the malicious demands, in fact. And then, of course, there's the ghastly Scottish legislation, which has been held back for now. And the founding of LGB Alliance, I think, was tremendously important. It was a masterstroke because it created a critical alternative to the promotion of an apparently monolithic queer voice in favour of gender identity rights. Once there was an alternative, no debate was simply not really possible. And that organisation is going from strength to strength. And we have a big problem, which is that all the organisations created out of a previous era of struggle for feminists and lesbians and gay men have been taken over and silenced. All the organisations that were terribly important to us in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, that we once could rely on, they're completely taken over and silenced. They still get the money and the recognition, and they partner with the state to provide advice and serve the state now in the management of problematic populations like us. These include things like the Fawcett Society, Stonewall, and so on and and so on. And we have to try ourselves to set up new organisations like LGBT Alliance, like WDI, but we don't usually have money or resources. The Sex Matters now does seem to have a bit of money, so that's really useful. We don't have paid workers, we don't have offices, we don't have automatic consultation as experts by policymakers and organisations. And setting all this up again is a massive task, but we are doing it. I mean, it is happening, which is absolutely extraordinary as a result of all the work everybody's been doing. So all that was achieved in the previous wave of feminism, things like CEDAW itself, the Convention on Women's Sex-Based Rights, the CEDAW Conference, international women's organisations, charities working all over the world, are captured, dependent on funders who have misogynist ideologies, infiltrated by well-funded and organised queer organisations who've been working away behind the scenes for decades, being parasitical on everything we created. All of this destruction and takeover happened whilst feminism was completely sidelined, and there was certainly at least 10 years when really nothing was going on. And it may be that the Russell Brand controversy shows what was happening to feminism at that time. For about 10 years there was an appalling misogyny in public life, of which is just one example, and this is now turning around. But there's so far to go to win back some respect for women's personhood and equal human status. I'm hoping that a renewed feminist campaign against pornography will emerge from this new stage. Maybe as women start to ask where all this horror, including transvestism and all the other male perversions now taking over public space, such as drag and furries, are coming from. But the most extraordinary impact and lasting monument to our work over 7 years in all the feminist organisations, including WDI, is the change we have created in public opinion. Back in 2016, there was a great deal of public sympathy for the transvestite demands because people, including politicians, NGOs, etc., had been groomed to see the campaign for gender identity rights as akin to and part of the campaign for gay rights. There was very little public knowledge, and the transvestite activists, determined to keep it this way by saying no debate, for instance, and trying to suppress all knowledge getting out by censorship of media, getting events cancelled, punishing women who spoke, and so on and so on. That was really very successful for quite a long time, and some of us probably thought we would never manage to get beyond that. But we did the work of public education by numerous means, particularly Kelly J. Keane standing for women events. First the Times, then other newspapers, but not the Guardian, began to cover the issue, and there was even a bit of coverage on television. It's been a huge and infuriating struggle to make this happen. I think we should acknowledge how big a struggle it was. But imagine how fast things can move from here as coverage in the media snowballs. Other books are being written. At one point I thought this was all moving at such a glacial pace that we would never get to the point of no return, but we're certainly there now. There is now so much knowledge in the public realm that the genie cannot be put back in the box. And the proof of this is the report of the latest British Social Attitudes Survey, which was in the papers on Thursday. The latest survey found a huge shift, and a really historically amazing shift in public opinion. Yes, in the public's acceptance of the notion of transgenderism. It says that the proportion of the British public describing themselves as not prejudiced, terrible language, which I'm amazed that anybody was able to reply reasonably to such a question. Those not prejudiced towards transgender people fell from 82% to 64%, which means that a lot of people, huge numbers of people, in 1 year, this is 21 to 22, were prepared to tick boxes saying they are prejudiced. Now that's an extraordinary situation. It's unfortunate the question was composed in such a way, but that's how it was. It's likely that the phraseology would put people off, and I don't know what it would have been if they hadn't used phraseology of that kind. And the answer to a more straightforward question, in which people do not have to say they are prejudiced, is even more impressive. In 2016, 58% of the British public agreed that people should be able to have the sex on their birth certificate changed if they wished. By 2022, that percentage had dropped to 30%. I mean, these are just incredible figures. They're incredible figures. Sometimes when we're just stuck in the struggle, it's difficult to see what is actually being achieved. So it's huge, likely unprecedented. I can't think of any other issue on which opinion has changed so fast. especially one on which the change was from liberal attitudes to more critical ones, which is so fascinating. It means that we need to seriously think about where we go from here in a greatly changed environment. I think it is more possible now to be strong about our intention to repeal the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, because the language, the thinking, has all moved on to that point. It's always been the position of the WDI that it should be repealed, but many feminist organisations, activists, writers on gender identity politics have seen this position in the past as too extreme. I'd like to say in the past, because I do think things are changing. They have spoken and written as if there was such a thing as a transgender person and such a thing as transgender rights. You'll have heard many women arguing that there are true transsexuals, men who genuinely have an essence of femininity or womanhood. These feminists did think it was unkind to say that this was actually a really dangerous delusion. They wanted to seem moderate, they wanted to be liked. So they said not all transgenders are like that and so on. In fact, I think there's much more recognition now that there's no such thing as true transsexuals. Much more recognition. It's a joke now. A lot of women use it as a joke. You know, how could anybody say such a thing? I don't know about you, but I do think that this is more generally recognised. And this is the moment when repeal of the GRA is beginning to seem entirely reasonable. So I think we should talk about how to make that happen, right? Because I think it is important. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, we've never really had to turn back and repeal legislation before. Not in my feminist career. I've not known of how to do that or that we would have to do that. But I think we have to here because this is so extraordinary. So the next little bit of my talk is really called the rear view mirror. And I think it's interesting to try and put what we have and are continuing to experience into perspective. To get a view into the rear view mirror, it might seem a bit early at this moment, but I think we can start to do that. We know that we are winning, but we don't know how far-reaching our victory will be. We will win on children, I'm sure of that, and there will be a massive scandal and suing over the terrible harm that's been done. I'm confident, particularly because the parents are on the warpath, as they are in the huge marches in Canada on this issue in the last week. In 108 cities, over 100,000 persons, and probably many more, that's just what's being reported, have been marching on this issue. So this has gone well beyond a feminist issue and what feminists think about any of this. So I do think we'll win on that. We may have started this, but it's now taken on. Well, I do think we'll probably win on sports, sex education, toilets, refuges, and the right to meet as lesbians and as women without men present. All of those things I think we're likely to win. So I think we'll go back to before on women's spaces. I think that's very possible, although I know there's quite a long way to go on all of these things. But I'm being optimistic, and I do think this will happen. But will we manage to extirpate the notion that some men are really women from culture and politics? And if not, then there will be endless hurdles over prizes, opportunities, and so on. And we will have to deal with the humiliation women have to suffer from seeing these men larping at being women on quiz shows, art shows, and so on. Their role in the culture will still be there. Yeah. And these men will continue to pump degrading notions of womanhood, sex stereotypes into the culture with very harmful effects on women, promoting pornification and the effeminization of women. And of course, where we need to get on this is where we are at this point on blackface. And I've said this before, and we'll say it again. We need to get there. We need to get to the point where, in Good Housekeeping magazine, there is a definition of what blackface is and why it's harmful and why nobody should do it. We need to get there on woman face, and that's the question, is whether we're going to get there on woman face. I think we'll achieve all of these other things, but will we get there on drag and woman face in general, and the recognition of how enormously harmful they are to women? And we need to bear in mind, as I'm sure we do, how little significance women have in the culture and how we are despised, and why, therefore, mocking us is not seen as a problem. So what we really need to do is to push transvestism back into its box as just a sexual perversion, not suitable in public places. Hopefully, if we manage this, then it will become less common for lesbians to transgender. And hopefully a resurgence of lesbian pride and strength will undermine this practice, and it will no longer be respected in any way, but understood as the mutilation of and violence against lesbians. We may not be quite there yet, but at some point this extraordinary time in history will be researched and written up by political scientists. I'm a political scientist, or what? I wasn't in the area of the discipline that is called social movements. So in fact, I have done a whole book on lesbian feminism, so one might reasonably say I'm in social movements to some extent. But it interests me how the politics of gender identity will be framed. Is it a social movement? Is our movement against this politics similar to the anti-Nazi League of the 1970s? Is that who we are? Some of us here will remember that, and remember how successful it was. Nazis, for instance, did in the 70s engage in the sort of violence that the transvestites do, and are involved in, and Nazis generally are involved in social and political takeover against a whole segment of the population, but women at this time rather than Jews. And it's different, but it's a militia. There's a violent militia out there attacking women's events. That's the situation that we have. But the gender identity movement is not typical of those usually studied in social movement research, which are women's, gay, black rights. It's not progressive, it's violent, it's taken up by the political establishment and corporations in a way that the WLM has never been, and it's enforced on women who are its unwilling victims. I mean, that's extraordinary in social movement terms. So I do look forward to when this is critically written about. And that's why it's so extraordinary, of course, that the left is indulging something that's so clearly not a social movement. But the gay movement now is also enforced to some extent, whereas feminism will never be. I mean, those of us who have to walk into Sainsbury's and see all the queer flags and so on and walk past them to get a pint of milk, something that is very hostile to our interests is now enforced by corporations. But there are lots of interesting comparisons. I do think it's fascinating to consider why all this has come about, and what its long-term consequences will be. How also does it fit with the wider politics of these times, which include climate catastrophe, frightening rise of authoritarian populism in Europe and elsewhere, really frightening. How will the political forces of the moment interact with the gender identity movement and its defeat? So how is it going to work with all of these things? I've never been involved in an aspect of feminist activism which appealed to a wider public, and particularly Christian conservatives and other branches of the right, in the way that this one is. I mean, it's not completely the case, because my politics on porn and prostitution have appealed to Christians and conservatives before, but not in large numbers and not leading to huge populist marches. This is something different. We started it, there isn't any question of that, but we'll certainly not be able to control it. So we need to ask the question whether it will create a dangerous backlash potentially against lesbians and gay men, and I think that's very possible. And when it's been entirely taken over by forces that are not feminist, will we let it run and turn our attention onto all the other aspects of our struggle that have been neglected whilst we confronted this challenge? I would like to turn attention to re-establishing lesbian culture and politics, challenging beauty practices, ending prostitution and pornography. And I don't think the conservative forces will likely follow me into these struggles in the way that they have into this particular struggle. Okay? What have we been? What are we being now? Well, we are certainly being, and have been, a ginger group. We are the ones who have created the excitement, created the ideas, got things going. But we are at a different point. And that's it, really.
Thank you very much.